So, this weekend marks the start of the 2024 Formula 1 World Championship, and for the first two races of the season, the races will take place on a Saturday, just like the Las Vegas Grand Prix did last year. Unless you lived in Europe, which was Sunday morning. Usually, whenever a new season is just around a corner, a lot of content creators like to do their predictions for the upcoming season, and given my channel is about motorsport, I thought, screw it, let's have a go myself. However, unlike other content creators who like to do theirs before preseason testing is started, I thought I would wait for that to conclude before giving my predictions. And given that the first race of the season is this weekend, I'm aiming for this video to be out before the first qualifying session of the season. So, future JW, could you tell me in text form if I've achieved that or not? I don't know what the answer is. Is it good or bad? Anyways, without further ado, let's go through my predictions for the 2024 Formula 1 World Championship. So, how I will lay this out is simple. I will start off with the Drivers Championship, starting from last place and working my way up to who I believe will win the title, which I think will be pretty obvious, but still. Then after I've done that, I will show you my Constructors Championship prediction, and then I will hand it over to you on what your predictions are in the comments below. Sound great? I hope so. So without any hold-ups, let's start off with who I think will be in last in the standings. In last place, and I know it might sound a bit cruel, but I've put Kevin Magnussen. Now this is not to say that K-Mag is a terrible driver or anything, because he isn't, but this is mainly based on two things. One being the teammate battle, as I believe just like last year that K-Mag will be beaten by Hülkenberg. Not by much, but I think over the season, Nico will once again just have the measure of K-Mag. And secondly, the car he's driving. Given the rumbles about the 2024 Haas before preseason testing, and even from their new team principal Io Komatsu, the signs are not great, and it looks like, judging from preseason testing as well, that Haas on paper have the worst car on the grid. I don't expect K-Mag to be pointless, but I don't think there will be many points coming Haas's way this season. In P19, I've put Logan Sargeant. Yes, even though I've said Haas have the worst car on the grid, I don't think they will fill out the last two places in the championship. 2023 was a terrible rookie season for Logan Sargeant, after so much promise surrounding him during his time in Formula 2. Logan has been given another year to prove himself and to try and improve on the disappointment of 2023. However, judging from preseason testing and judging from some of the teething issues Williams have had, whilst I don't expect Williams to be fighting towards the back, I am sadly expecting Logan to have another tricky season where he'll only gather a handful of points, and I expect him to be heavily beaten again by his more experienced teammate Alex Albon. I haven't put him in last, as I think he will just get the measure of K-Mag, given the Williams on paper is a much better car than the Haas, but I do think he'll only beat one of them, which could lead to him losing his job at the end of the season. But only time will tell. On the topic of Haas, in P18 I've put Nico Hülkenberg. Before the start of the 2023 season, many people, including myself, wrote Nico off, as given he hadn't done a full season in F1 since 2019, a lot of people expected him to struggle and get beaten by K-Mag in the standings, given the incredible 2022 season K-Mag had on his return. However, this didn't happen, and Nico proved a lot of people wrong when it came to qualifying, as he was able to extract the most out of the car compared to K-Mag to put the Haas in a decent position on the grid. However, when it came to the race, he would often tumble down the order due to the one thing that has been an Achilles tendon for Haas since 2019: tyres. Despite this though, Nico had a good return to the championship, and I expect him to once again beat K-Mag. However, given the Haas appears to be the worst car on paper, I don't expect him to be quite high up in the standings, which is why I have put him in P18. Next up is P17, and in this position I put Zhou Guanyu. Zhou's 2023 season was okay to say the least. At times he looked like he could beat Bottas on certain occasions and would put in the odd brilliant performance, such as in Hungary last year where he was able to qualify in a career best 5th. However, in the race itself, he would throw that away by getting bogged down at the start and then causing an accident at turn 1. Zhou is quite a hard driver to rate, to be honest, At times he looks decent, other times he performs terribly. Sauber throughout pre-season testing, whilst they've looked better than Haas, haven't really set the timing screens alight, and I expect them to be fighting towards the back with maybe the odd points finish here and there, which is why I've put Cho in P17, which means on the topic of Sauber, I've put his teammate Bottas in P16, once again beating his teammate. Bottas I don't think is as bad as people make him out to be, but I don't think he helps himself either on certain occasions. His experience for a team like Sauber is valuable, and I do think he will beat his teammate again, but it won't be by much given the car he's in. Once again, I expect a tricky season for Sauber, and I also expect there at times to be inconsistency from both drivers. Moving on to P15, and I've put Alexander Albon. Now I was tempted to put him a little bit higher, given the amount of brilliant performances he's done for the team since he returned to F1 in 2022. However, throughout pre-season testing, Williams have had a few teething troubles, and given the likes of VCarb are ahead of them in terms of performance, I don't think Albon will be able to beat any of their two drivers, and in time, I also expect him to be beaten by another set of teammates, which I will get to in a bit. Still though, I will go on the record and say that it will be close between P10 and P15, but I think in the end, Albon will end up getting the wooden spoon in that battle. But one thing for certain, he will definitely score a lot more points than Sargent and will be the driver that picks up the majority of Williams' points like he did last year. In P14, and it might surprise you, but I've put Esteban Ocon. Now that might sound a bit harsh to put Ocon in P14 given how good of a driver Ocon is. However, throughout pre-season testing, reports have not been great about Alpine's race pace, with some even suggesting that they have the second worst on the grid. Despite all the weight shedding that they did with the paint, although they've added some recently to the front nose, the Alpine appears to be overweight and aerodynamically inefficient. Even though I expect them to be struggling at the start of the season, I do expect as the season goes on that the team will improve. I'm not expecting them to have the same sort of improvement McLaren had last year, but I do expect them to be in a position where they can once again fight towards the sharp end of the midfield. However, despite this, I do believe their poor start to the season will be reflected in the standings, which is why I have put Ocon in P14. Again though, I expect P15 to P10 to be very close. Moving on to P13, and I have put Yuki Tsunoda. VCarb, or as we'll call them from now on VCrap, have looked pretty good throughout pre-season testing, with some elements of the car looking very similar to the Red Bull RB19 from last year. Tsunoda arguably had his best year in F1 last year, despite the tricky first half of the season the team formerly known as AlphaTauri had. However, after Nick de Vries was cruelly sacked from AlphaTauri to make way for Daniel Ricciardo to return, there were at times where Yuki looked a bit off the pace and looked at times like Ricciardo had the measure of him, despite Yuki having more time in the car than Daniel did. Once improvements came in for AlphaTauri towards the end of the season, the team were regularly fighting towards the sharp end of the midfield, and during pre-season testing, they looked to potentially have the 6th quickest car on the grid. The reason I've put Yuki in the middle of the P10 to P15 battle is because I think at times there will be some inconsistencies, some of which will be down to the team, others down to the driver. So that's why I've put Yuki in P13. In P12, I put Pierre Gasly. Pierre had a brilliant season in 2023, often falling under the radar by many people. Before the season began, a lot of people believed that Ocon would beat Gasly in the standings, and in the first couple of races, it looked like that was going in that direction. However, from Australia onwards, Gasly picked up his form and was at times just having the measure over Ocon. Like with Ocon, Gasly also picked up a podium in 2023 at the Dutch Grand Prix in Zandvoort and even picked up a top 3 finish in the sprint race at Spa. However, as mentioned earlier, Alpine look like they are going to be struggling at the start of the season. But once improvements come in for Alpine, I expect Pierre to climb his way up the table, but only into 12th due to the poor start to the season Alpine are expected to have. Yet again though, I expect Gasly to just beat Ocon in the standings, but once again it will be very close between the pair. In P11, I've put Daniel Ricciardo. Daniel made his return to F1 from the Hungarian Grand Prix last year after being booted out by McLaren due to numerous amounts of poor results. Daniel proved a lot of people wrong last year and proved that his time at McLaren was just a blip, with him putting in some good performances in the races that he did. Daniel during those races looked to have the measure of Yuki on most occasions, and given how close P10 to P15 will be, as I keep reiterating, I expect him to not only beat Yuki by a small margin, but once Alpine get their act together, also have one of them in between himself and Yuki, given how close the battle between Alpine and VCRAP will be during the course of the season once Alpine make those improvements. Now moving on to P10, and in this position, I've put Lance Stroll. Now I know what you are thinking. Why are you saying that Lance will be a part of the P10 to P15 battle when he is in a car that on paper is way ahead of both VCRAP and Alpine? Well, you just have to look at last year. 2023 by all accounts was a terrible season for Lance, as even though he had a car that in the first half of the season was fighting towards the front of the field, hence why Alonso got a numerous amount of podiums last year, Lance was nowhere near where the car should have been. Now fair enough, the first couple of races for Lance looked very promising. However, from Australia onwards, his inconsistency, combined with a huge amount of poor performances, saw him only score 74 points and saw him finish 10th in the championship, whereas Alonso finished up in 4th with 206 points. Even during the second half of the season, when Aston started to drop back in performance, Fernando was doing all the heavy lifting for Aston, and I expect the same thing to happen again in 2024. I don't expect the points gap to be just as big this time, given Aston seem to be behind the current top 4 teams, but I still expect it to be quite significant. Significant to the point where Lance ends up being involved in the P10 to P15 battle, which Lance I believe will just come out on top given the car he has. Whether Lance keeps his drive this time or not, given Aston are having a hypercar program in WEC next year, remains to be seen. So that's the P10 to P15 battle sorted out, so now on to the rest of the top 10. In P9, I've put Fernando Alonso. Now P9 might sound a bit harsh for Fernando, given where he finished last year. However, Aston appear not to be in the same position that they were in the first half of last year, which allowed Fernando to be that high up in the standings. Aston, whilst they haven't looked bad in pre-season testing, appear to be behind the likes of Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes, and of course Red Bull. Despite the amazing talent of Alonso, I think 9th is the highest he can manage this time around. Whether he will be with Aston for 2025 or whether he gets a phone call from Merck, only time will tell. Now moving on to the top 8, and in P8 I've put Oscar Piastri. Now I was tempted to put him a bit higher up in the table, given McLaren looked good in pre-season testing despite some teething issues. However, given the pace Russell was able to show on the last day of testing in the Mercedes, I've decided to bump Oscar down a bit. Now this doesn't mean to say that Oscar will have a poor season, as I believe he will continue to show the amazing performance that he did throughout last year. However, given how close it will be between McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes, I expect him to draw the short straw when it comes to that battle. But maybe I'll be proved wrong, who knows. In P7, I've put George Russell. Again, like with Piastri, it seems a bit cruel to put him down here. But once again, given how close the battle will be between Mercedes, Ferrari and McLaren, I do believe Russell will be quite low down. I do expect him to have a better season compared to 2023 though, as last year was not a great year for George. As long as he continues the pace he showed in Abu Dhabi last year and brings back the performances that we saw from him in 2022, then Russell should have a better season. And who knows, it might lead to him becoming the new team leader at Mercedes after Lewis leaves, depending on what sort of driver Mercedes want to partner George with for 2025. In P6, I've put Carlos Sainz Jr. Carlos will of course be entering his final year with the Tifosi as a result of Lewis Hamilton joining the team next year and the fact that Charles has signed a new long-term deal with the team in January. I have made a video talking about Lewis's move to Ferrari, which you can check out via the circular exclamation mark on the top right, as it also talks about Sainz in that video. Carlos will be looking to end his stint with Ferrari on a high, and whilst I do think he will have a good year, I still don't think he'll be able to beat Leclerc, nor do I think he will beat the guy that will replace him. I do expect some races where Carlos will be off the pace, but will counteract that with some brilliant performances. Where he ends up for 2025 is still a mystery, whether that's with Sauber, provided Audi doesn't cancel their F1 plans, or with Aston remains to be seen. In P5, I've put Lando Norris. Again, like with Oscar, I was tempted to bump him up higher and even at one point considered putting him up in third. However, looking at Perez's pace during pre-season testing and also Mercedes' pace as well, I've ended up bumping Lando down to P5. However, like with Oscar, that doesn't mean I think Lando will have a poor season. Far from it. Since 2021, Lando has been amazing for McLaren and has proven himself to be a real team leader. I expect him to once again have an amazing season, especially now that McLaren seem to be in a position where they are back fighting towards the front. Which, as someone who has watched F1 since the age of 3 and growing up watching McLaren fight towards the front, it is really amazing to see. Whether Lando can finally get his first win this year is another question though. In P4, I've put the 7-time world champion, Lewis Hamilton. Lewis will be bowing out of Mercedes at the end of this year after over a decade competing with the team in which he has achieved 6 world titles to add to the one he already got at McLaren. Lewis, I believe, will end his time with Mercedes on a high note, and given the pace Merc showed during pre-season testing compared to Ferrari and McLaren, it looks like that could happen. Whilst I don't think he will win his 8th title this year, as I think Merc is still a long way from competing for the title again, I think him achieving a win this year, providing certain circumstances fall into place, would be an amazing way to end his time there. In P3, I've put Sergio Perez. Now, look, don't get it twisted. I am well aware of how quick Red Bull were last year, and I am also aware of how quick Red Bull have been throughout pre-season testing. However, let's not kid ourselves. Sergio's 2023 season was terrible. Despite having the most dominant car in F1 history underneath him, Perez throughout the season didn't drive to the car's ability. Now, fair enough, in the first 5 races, apart from Australia where he had a brake issue in qualifying which wrecked his weekend, Perez drove the car to its ability, with him grabbing 2 wins at Jeddah and Baku. However, from Monaco onwards, Perez seemed to be in no man's land, not helped with the number of mistakes he was making and a lack of pace during qualifying, which saw him fail to be in Q3 on 9 occasions throughout 2023. And even when he was in Q3, he would struggle to get onto the front row, with him at times either being in the middle of the top 10 or in the lower reaches of the top 10. Perez needs to step up in 2024, however sadly, I don't see that happening. Now sure, there is a chance he could do what he did last year, which is do well in the first few races, but then afterwards I sadly see him struggling again, which could signal the end of his time, not just at Red Bull, but also in Formula 1 as well, as I personally think unless Williams end up having 2 vacant seats next year, then another team is not going to want to sign him. But only time will tell, I guess. So we have 2 drivers left, and in P2 I've gone with Charles Leclerc. Ferrari looked strong throughout pre-season testing, and they appear to be the closest to Red Bull, just as they were at the end of last year. Given I believe Sergio will struggle again this year, I expect Charles to be the man that will prevent Red Bull from getting another 1-2 in the championship. Charles had a very strong end to last year, and I expect that to continue into 2024. And whenever Red Bull have an off day, I expect him to pick up the odd win here or there. So now we are down to just one more driver, and I think it was pretty obvious before this video started. In P1, as you may have guessed, I've gone with Max Verstappen. Because who else would it be? Max is an absolute freak of nature right now, and is in my opinion the best driver in the world, not just in F1, but also in motorsport as a whole. If you put this guy in sports cars, touring cars, GT racing or whatever, Max would still win in those categories. In fact, and I agree with Josh Revel on this opinion, I generally believe that the dominance last year wasn't all down to the car. Yeah sure, the Red Bull was a dominant car last year, not least the most dominant car in F1 history, but I think a huge majority of that was down to Max. You just have to look at the constructors' standings from last year. If you take away the points Checo accumulated last year, Red Bull would still win the constructors by over 150 points. Max single-handedly won the Constructors' title for Red Bull. That's how insane he was last year. Adrian Newey looks like he has once again designed an absolute monster, and with Max in the team, I expect him to once again dominate the championship. Maybe even more so than he did last year. But hopefully not. Let's hope they don't win some of the races this year, rather than just one. So there you go, there is my predictions for this year's Drivers' Championship. And in terms of the Constructors, this is my prediction for that on your screen right now. In 10th place, I've put Haas, 9th place Sauber, 8th Williams, as I believe Logan will hold the team back in terms of points, 7th Alpine, once they get their act together, 6th V-Crap, 5th Aston Martin, 4th McLaren, 3rd Mercedes, 2nd Ferrari, and 1st Red Bull. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you agree with my predictions? And if not, let me know your predictions down below. Thanks for watching and enjoy the 2024 Formula 1 World Championship.